This podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Building Technology and Safety, IBTS, a national nonprofit organization and trusted partner to public, nonprofit, and private clients. IBTS's work is guided by a board of directors with representatives from the Council of State Governments, the International City-County Management Association, the National Association of Counties, the National Governors Association, and the National League of Cities. Thanks for tuning in. This is On Further Inspection with IBTS. I'm your host, Gabby Geraci, and today I'm interviewing Patrick Howell, who is the Program Manager for Community Resilience here at IBTS. Patrick, I'm so happy to have you here today for our conversation on community resilience and climate action. But before we begin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your work here in IBTS?
Okay. So my name is Patrick Howell. I'm a program manager for our community resilience initiatives at IBTS. I've been with IBTS for just over 7 years now, coming to IBTS with quite a varied background as well. So I've been working with or in local governments for about 20 years in various capacities, from finance and administration to project management, and now in the kind of disaster and climate resilience space. Prior to IBTS, I spent about 2.5 years working in the Dominican Republic, where I was working on some education and healthcare issues. And I would say it was really there when I was in the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic that the impacts of climate change and extreme or natural disasters really came to the forefront of my mind and became a focus of my career. Living in fairly remote and austere communities, whenever there was a tropical storm or a major drought, either or, the impacts on the communities were very, very real. And we were on the very front line of those impacts. And I would say primarily what I do is I help communities to, assess what their climate and disaster vulnerabilities might be in their own communities, and then help them build actionable plans so that they can address those vulnerabilities and improve community resilience, improve outcomes for all residents within their community.
It's wonderful, Patrick. And do you do work in a specific region, or is it not restricted by boundaries?
Really not restricted by boundaries. I mean, disasters and climate impacts have no boundaries. So we're working across the country, as well as in Puerto Rico and even in the broader Caribbean.
Looking at climate and looking at climate actionable strategies and climate action, when they think of climate action, what does that mean and what should that mean to them?
Well, I think there's something inherent in that term of climate action, and that is the acknowledgement that we have changing climate conditions, right? So I think for any community that's interested in climate action, first, we do have to acknowledge that the climate is changing, that there are various impacts. And so therefore, what can we do about it? And so I think, related to what we can do about it in the climate action, then there's really kind of two lines of effort. The first would be to limit or mitigate the additional impacts that we might have on the climate and the environment. And so these things might be, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency of buildings, transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, things that are really going to mitigate additional negative impact on the environment and the climate. I think the second primary line of effort would then be related to adaptation, is how are we as humans adapting to the changing conditions and the changing environment around us. And so depending on where you might be and what the impacts of climate change are in your community, that might be adapting to rising sea levels. It could be adapting to more severe or more frequent tornadoes or hurricanes or wildfires, adapting to the impacts of extreme heat in urban areas or even rural areas as well. So I when I think of climate action, it's those things. One, acknowledging that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And then two is mitigating and adapting to the impact strategies.
So how would a city go about planning those strategies? How do you get from research and understanding of what your what your emissions are, where your faults are, and how to get to a point where you're actually making progress within that plan?
First, we have to know what our baseline conditions are. And so in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to be doing an inventory of where those emissions are coming from. So you understand, what are your biggest polluters? And therefore, what are the biggest areas of concern that need to be prioritized and addressed? But I don't want to keep the adaptation strategies out of the conversation as well, because I think, we want to be doing these concurrently and simultaneously, both the mitigation and adaptation approaches. And so therein too, we first need to understand what our baseline conditions are. Two things to really understand in terms of both mitigation and adaptation is related to your natural environment, as well as then, the human and social environment. And so in your natural environment, especially for the adaptation side, you want to see, where have been the biggest impacts of changing climate conditions. Are there certain neighborhoods that are now flooding that weren't flooding 20 years ago? Are there certain neighborhoods that are experiencing extreme heat that a generation ago, extreme heat wasn't even an issue? And so some of those things are kind of the natural environment dimensions that we really want to understand first. On the human side of things too, I think it's really important to understand and have front and center as we're doing our climate action planning is the impact that it has on people, and ensuring that we are addressing those kind of first and foremost. Some of the things that we can look at are, various health indicators and trying to identify any trends related to certain health indicators across your population. So, for example, are cases of asthma going up? Are cases of cancer increasing, again, kind of across generations, perhaps? And then your second question to ask after that is, are these trends, are we seeing these in particular neighborhoods or within particular demographics or segments of the population? I think because oftentimes we see the most negative impacts from environmental degradation are happening to those communities that are historically at a disadvantage, either socially, economically, or otherwise. And so as we begin to collect this data from the natural environment, from the human environment, and then lay those data over, then we can really begin to see where our priorities should be in terms of climate planning.
Is climate action planning different from emergency management and what the emergency management office in a local government typically does, which is that, emergency management plan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first, I think that they're going to be complementary. I think emergency management is going to be a key stakeholder in any type of climate action process. Mm-hmm. But I do think there are some distinct differences. And I think perhaps that one of the better ways to distinguish emergency management, hazard mitigation from, let's say, climate action could be, these very acute disasters, these quick happening disasters, such as, your mudslides, your floods, your earthquakes, hurricanes, things that happen relatively quickly and have immediate impact on the community, versus climate action really addressing these kind of, slow burn, slow onset events that we experience from changing climate, such as extreme heat, such as incremental sea level rising, and other things like this. And what are those impacts of those slow onset events or changing conditions on our economy, on the way that the government functions, on the way that the government interacts with its own residents and with its community. And so in that sense, I think that climate action planning can be much more comprehensive and robust in terms of inclusion of potential impacts on the community.
When you work with a community or when you work with a county or a city, what is that process like of everybody getting on the same page that this is what we need to do and it's important because, but also now we need to be proactive in finding funding, whether it be internal or external, to actually get it done. So from your experience, what is that process like?
Yeah, the process, I mean, not to sugarcoat it, it can be really tricky, right? Because I think within an organization, within a local government organization, and then especially if you expand that out to the broader community, we have lots of different interests, some of which are competing, some of which are complementary. And so as we develop a plan, just like in any other local government planning process, whether it's a comprehensive plan or it's a housing plan, what have you, you really have to try to do your best to address all of the concerns and priority areas of all of your different stakeholders, but keeping it realistic and pragmatic so that it's something that you can actually implement. So I think when it comes to climate action planning, it really is getting your primary stakeholders around a table to review what your baseline conditions are, talk about what those impacts are in very real terms to the various stakeholders. So, for example, given our baseline assessment of what the changing climate conditions are and what those impacts are on the residents, talking to your public works director about what does this actually mean for public works, right? What types of new investments will public works require in terms of, perhaps capital projects or staffing, even to address, the increasing demands that climate change is placing on the population. Similarly to your economic development committee or task force or director, what are going to be the impacts of climate change on the economy? If we're looking at mitigation strategies and we're trying to transition from fossil fuels to more renewable energy sources, what does that mean for the economy? What types of incentives might your economic development director need to start thinking about or putting into place? And so kind of going through what climate change means for each one of those different stakeholders, I think is really key to success to one, getting buy-in from all of those departments so that you can make a robust and comprehensive plan, but also ensuring that they are, a part of the implementation process. They see not just the why in terms of, the climate is changing and we really need to do something about it, but they see the why, particularly as it relates to them and their responsibilities. And so I think that's a really, really important step. Get your stakeholders together, make sure that they have a voice at the table, and that as you go through the planning process, that voice is reflected.
That makes sense. And two things. So how long does it take to make a plan like this from your experience, and how often should it be updated?
That can really vary. I think some cities, some counties are really, really ambitious about this, and they've made it a strategic priority, whether that is from constituent demands or whether it is from elected leadership, whoever their champion might be, they could be pushing really, really hard for this. And so therefore they might, muster all of their resources and all of their staff and put a lot of effort into this, and perhaps they can get it done in 6 months or so. And that would include doing the research to gather all of your data and understand what those baseline conditions are, doing the analysis to identify priority areas, developing action plans, et cetera. So you can do it relatively quickly if you've got the motivation and the resources to do so. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you might have a community that, isn't as well resourced. Maybe the leadership isn't quite as ambitious about climate change. And so the staff member that's really trying to drive this forward might have many more obstacles, right? And so that could take a much longer time to do all of those steps, really. So yeah, it can really vary depending on, the size of the organization, the size of the community, how much data you need to collect, right, and how much resources are being dedicated to the process. What
is the benefit of bringing somebody in from the outside of the organization to help you throughout the planning process?
The benefit is really great. I'm thinking about that well-resourced community. What would be the benefit there? Still, you're having an unbiased third-party organization come in with expertise to see what the organization is doing, to look at the data that you already have, and to provide that extra bit of support. That can go a really long way, not just in developing the plan, but also to help justify the plan and justify resources behind the plan. So, for example, one community that we're working with in Minnesota, they are very well resourced. They are very ambitious about climate action, and they're fairly on the vanguard of climate action for local governments. But the real benefit that they have experienced from IBTS is we've uncovered several different things, several different strategies that they could add to their existing plan. But also now when that plan goes to county commission and the county commission is required to then allocate resources, they have that third-party, non-biased expert opinion to say, hey, if you guys really want to get this done, this is what these experts are saying. Right. I think on the other end, if I think about the smaller communities or under-resourced communities, having somebody that knows how to navigate this process can be extremely valuable. Addressing climate change, climate resilience, disaster preparedness, that can be a really daunting and overwhelming task, particularly if you have a limited staff capacity. Perhaps that staff doesn't even have much experience in this area. I mean, climate change, disaster resilience is a very complex and multifaceted field. Within it, we are looking at some of the things that I've already mentioned. We're looking at environmental dimensions. We're looking at human dimensions. We're thinking about infrastructure. We're thinking about the economy. And so to have somebody that can bring all of these things together, that can help you through the process of assessing your baseline conditions, of doing the data analysis, developing objectives and plans based on priorities that the data is telling you, and then developing implementation plans, I think can be really, really valuable for a community that might not really know how to do that, but they really want to do that.
Yeah, wonderful. And tell me a little bit about your actual work. For example, what you were just mentioning. What are some of the highlights of doing this type of work for you? What excites you about going to work and with these communities and really, rolling up your sleeves and getting it done?
Yeah, I mean, I really love that multifaceted aspect of it, right? So when working on climate action, I think, one, you're working on something that is a very pressing and urgent issue that has very real impacts in both the short term and the long term for communities. And so to be able to work on, a plan and the way that this plan is going to get implemented, that's going to have that impact is really quite fulfilling. I think then, aside from that multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary nature of this type of work is really interesting to me as well. Again, I get to work on issues of energy and energy justice. I get to work on issues of social equity. I get to work on issues of, flooding and disaster preparedness and mitigating the impacts of extreme weather events. So all of these things really capture my interest, while at the same time, they have a very real impact on very real people.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about the communities that maybe aren't seeing such significant climate issues right now. Maybe they don't see long term yet, or haven't seen the impacts, such as a hurricane coming through, or, these huge floods. How can they be motivated, right, to do something like a climate action plan, despite not feeling that urgency?
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the first things that came to mind is that even for those communities that may not be experiencing the impacts of a changing climate right now, they likely are in the future in several different ways. One, eventually those impacts are likely to creep in. I'm thinking in perhaps a community in middle America that isn't experiencing sea level rise, that isn't experiencing strong hurricanes, right? They're not exposed to those types of hazards or threats. But however, what we are going to see is that those communities, those residents that live in zones that are susceptible to those types of hazards are going to begin moving away from that danger. They're going to be moving into middle America. And so I think a lot of these communities are going to start experiencing an influx of, what we're calling climate migrants, right? And so even though they may not have changing climate conditions, they will have changing, human dimensions and human conditions in their communities. And I think it's something that they should be, thinking about and preparing for. And
what sort of similarities do you see among the government entities that you work with, for example? It wouldn't be intuitive that these are similarities or things that they're facing.
Again, the first thing that came to mind is that this is a difficult issue. And the similarity across everyone is that there's differences across everyone, right? Because I think every community is different, both in the types of, climate hazards or climate threats that they face, but also in their demographics and the resources that they have to dedicate to this. And so that adds to the challenge of addressing climate change and these issues. So I think, we can find unity in the difficulty of addressing this issue, but also finding unity in, understanding that this is something that we really need to begin addressing so that we can, secure our homes and our prosperity and ensure, thriving communities for future generations.
Wonderful. And I can imagine also that the fact that you are able to see and witness action plans coming from different places and different demographics, addressing different issues, puts you in a very special spot to be able to help identify strategies that were done elsewhere that could fit in a community that, otherwise wouldn't have heard about that strategy having happened somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's another thing that I really love about my job too, is that I'm able to then, take experiences and knowledge from these other places and apply it in seemingly, very different contexts. So something that might have happened in St. Lucia, for example, mainland United States might not consider that because that's a small island developing state. It's a different situation, right? But actually, St. Lucia is doing some pretty innovative and neat things around climate action that I think we could apply to, middle America, for example. And so you're absolutely right, Gabby. Yeah, being able to pick out some of those strategies and some of those innovations that other communities are doing, apply them across the country and across, various territories is a lot of fun. Yeah,
I can imagine just having that connect the dots where, you're connecting communities with ease because of your position. That's really, really cool.
Yeah. I think if I was going to give one piece of advice to somebody who is interested in climate action planning, doesn't really know where to start, because I know there's lots of us out there, is find yourself a framework that can help you conceptualize and approach this issue. Again, it's very complex. This touches lots of different sectors, lots of different people, and lots of different interests. And so I think having a structured approach to conceptualize, to assess, and then put together a plan is going to be extremely helpful. A lot of this hard work has already been done by others, including IBTS. And so we don't need to recreate the wheel with a lot of this. And so find a framework, find an approach that you think is going to fit best for your community, so that you don't have any of that guesswork to do. Just fill in the blanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. To our audience, thanks for listening to On Further Inspection. We invite you to tune in again as we continue to explore topics and trends that are helping our communities thrive.